Welcome to part 5 of the Wyld Whirl Quilt Along. This week we are making the quilt top. This is a very exciting week. We are going to take the blocks that we made last week and sew them all together and make a quilt top. It's very exciting stuff. We are going to start by laying out all of the blocks so that we can get a good look at them. You can do this on the floor. You can also make what's called a design wall, which you stick up a piece of like flannel or batting for the blocks to stick to. I just use the floor. So I get them all laid out. First thing I see is I've got two fabrics that are the same touching each other there. So I made a swap on those. And then I kind of look at where the light values are compared to the medium, compared to the dark, try to maybe spread those out a little bit more and just kind of turn and rearrange things until I have something that I'm liking. And then once I have that, I take a photo and use the black and white filter so I can better see the values. And this just allows me to see where the dark values are placed and the medium values, and then I can make adjustments. So I saw that my dark values were all kind of going vertical, so I wanted to move some of those around, and I ended up just rearranging all the blocks a whole bunch. Don't stress yourself out too much about this stage. You really could spend infinite amount of time rearranging and rearranging the blocks. Just get it to a place where you like it and go forward, because if you hate it, you can undo it, which you will watch me do later on. So anyways, I got to this place. I said, hey, this looks good enough for me. Let's go ahead and get this all sewn up. So we are going to be using a method called web piecing. And to do that, we are gathering the blocks up into piles. So look at this as like my A column, and I'm taking the first one, putting it on top of the second one, grabbing both of those and putting them on top of the third. And don't worry, I'm going to do a quick demonstration of web piecing, so don't feel like you have to follow this right now. I'm going to go into it more in depth in the next part of this video, but I just wanted to show kind of how I'm gathering up the blocks for this quilt. I did a really good job showing my label to the camera each time, but you're just picking up the block, setting it down on top of the next one, creating a pile, and then being sure to put your label at the top center of each pile of blocks. This is important. So here is my little small size demonstration for web piecing. What we're doing with web piecing is instead of sewing each piece together one at a time, we're going to sew all of the rows together at once using a chain piecing method, the same method we've been piecing with this whole time. So I have these pieces laid out with the numbers on them to kind of help visually demonstrate, but it's the same thing I just did. I'm picking up the first piece in the column, setting it on top of the second piece, picking up both of those and setting those on top of the third until I have all of my piles. And if it helps, you can make little labels like this for your blocks. This is just masking tape. Really easy way to keep track of your blocks, because I did mess this up a little bit. You'll see here in a minute. But once we have all of our piles, we head over to the sewing machine, and we're going to start with the A pieces and the B pieces, and we'll be sewing them together. And the easiest way I have remembered this is I look at it like a book, and I'm turning the B1 page over onto the A1 page, and then I'm sewing down the spine, if that makes sense. So I'm getting those lined up and then sewing those two pieces together. And then I'll take A2 and B2. I will turn it like a page in a book, bloop, and then match those up and sew them together. So at this stage, I don't typically use pins. If there are points to match, I will pin them, but I will just pin each block as I go while I'm sitting at the sewing machine instead of pinning them all ahead of time. And then I clearly cut one of my blocks wrong. So anyways, this is just for practice, so we're going with it. And then I'm bringing that whole string back and I am attaching C1 on to B1. So this is how we are creating the rows all at once, is we are just chain piecing each column onto the previous column, one after the other. This works really well for like a throw size or smaller. Once your quilt starts getting larger, this can be a little bit cumbersome, but in general, it's a really great technique to know how to do. If you're ever making checkerboard blocks, you can use this technique. But now we're at the pressing station, and I am pressing my first row to the right, to the side. And this is important so that we can match up these seams later. We're going to do what's called nesting seams. So I've got those seams pressed to the right, and I'm pressing the next row to the left. I tend to keep my rows connected at the pressing stage so I can easily see which way I need to press each row. If it is kind of hard to get it onto your ironing table because it's cumbersome, snip them apart, but make sure that you keep a label on the row so you know which row is which. So we are going to start with sewing the 1 row to row 2. So I'm just snipping apart each row, and then yeah, if you don't have labels, make sure you're marking which row is which. So we're matching these up, and then because we've pressed the seams to the side and they're going the opposite directions, they kind of just notch together really nicely. And we can put a pin in. I like to put it at a little bit of a diagonal. This helps hold the seams to the side as they're going through the machine. And then we are sewing this row together at our scant 1/4 inch that we've been using. If you have areas where your blocks aren't quite lining up, just do your best to get things sewn together and then go ahead and press these long row seams open. So I like to press each row as I go. And then I sewed on that 3rd row, and then we have a nicely point matched little block here. So now let's go do the same thing for our actual quilt top. So I have my A column of blocks that's going on my left leg. I have my B column of blocks that's going to go on my right leg. And then I'm taking the first one of B, flipping it over like a page in a book onto the A, and then sewing down that spine. Be really careful to make sure that you're sewing together the right sides of the block. It's really easy to accidentally kind of turn them in your hand and sew the wrong sides together. So then I'm taking what is essentially B2 onto A2, matching those up and sewing them together. I don't really use pins. I like to just match things up. And then if I need to adjust them as they're going through the sewing machine, I can do that. But I find it's just a lot faster and easier to work without pins. If I am trying to match up a specific seam, then I'll use pins. But for the most part, I don't really use pins. I also will mention I have my stitch length turned down again here. So I'm at that 2.0 stitch length, and I'm using my extension table, which is nice, gives me a little bit more surface area to work with. So now here I'm going to be attaching on column C, and this is actually where I made a little bit of a mistake. So we're going to back up so I can show you where I made a mistake so you don't make the same mistake I do right here. This was actually the top of the pile and this was the bottom. So instead of attaching C1 onto A1 and B1, I attached it onto A3 and B3. I got my whole thing turned around. Yep, learn from my mistake. Don't do that. But I'm just sewing the blocks together here. Try not to let it drag because it can pull and then it sends your stitch line all ski-wampus. And then if I have areas where my pieces aren't quite lining up, like that little block right there, just kind of do your best. Just kind of fudge it. Get them sewn together. So then we're attaching the next block on, and I'm just going to continue working my way down until I have all of the C blocks attached to all of my B blocks. And it does get a little wonky at the end. That's why I was saying like a throw size works well for this. Once you get bigger, you may want to use a different method, just sew each row at a time, or you could break it up into smaller sections and do each section on its own. But we've got all of those sewn. Here's what that looks like. This is why they call it web piecing, I'm assuming, because you kind of end up with this little like web in between, I guess. I don't know. And then we're pressing. So I am pressing this first row to the right, and I'm pressing both of those blocks, and then I'll press the next set to the left, and then I'll press the last row to the right. So just make sure you're alternating. It doesn't really matter which side you start with as long as you alternate as you go, pressing in between each blocks. And then I'm back at my sewing machine and I'm just matching up the rows. So I'm going to those sections where I chain pieced and I'm matching those up first. And then I'm kind of working my way out from there and pinning the rest of the row together. So once I get to the stage of sewing rows together, I do like to pin more. This is mostly because you will likely have more areas where you're trying to match up the seams. So more pins. And then if you have one like this orange piece is a little bit longer than the piece I'm sewing it to. I'm kind of just splitting the difference, going to the middle and trying to just kind of spread it out along that piece. If you get to an issue where it is like significantly longer, you can kind of just push it all the way to one side and like tuck it in at the corner where you're pinning. If you have a couple of tucks like that, it's not a big deal. Honestly, they'll disappear once we wash the quilt. It's not uncommon at all. So don't stress if that happened to you. And then you can see here, like my blocks aren't lining up perfectly. I'm just kind of going from a 1/4 inch to now we're at like 3/8, and then I'm gonna ease it back over to a 1/4 inch. It's fine. It's totally fine. As long as you've got a good like 1/8 of an inch at least, I would say you're good. If you get anywhere where you missed the piece and it's not quite sewn, I would seam rip and fix it just because you don't want it to fall apart later. Structural integrity is the only place where I say that like you have to fix things because you don't want it to fall apart later. Cosmetics, it's whatever. So anyways, here's another view of sewing on the final row. I just kind of wanted to give you an angle of what it looks like. You can see my whole arm is kind of doing the work of pushing this quilt top along, and then I'm constantly kind of throwing it back up on the table to make sure that the weight of the quilt top is on the table so it's not pulling on my needle as it's going through the machine. And I got to hear and I was like, yay, quilt top. Oh, no, wait, what? Wait, why are those together? Those aren't supposed to be together. So yeah, I showed you that mistake earlier where I accidentally turned the whole top and sewed the wrong row of blocks on. This was the only block that bothered me, so I just fixed the one block. I seam ripped really quick, and then I was able to just kind of sew it back in, going over those stitch lines that I did before. And then I got to here and I was like, cool, I was sewing with air that entire time on this last seam that I need to sew. That makes 100% sense. Got the machine threaded, got all things working, and finally got this last seam sewn. And here's my quilt top. I love it. It's scrappy and random and weird and adorable. And I went in and pressed the seams. While I was in here, I kind of gave everything just a really good press. And there we have it, a beautiful finished quilt top. I'm so excited about this. Next week, we will baste it. And then in week 7, we will quilt it. I'm taking you all the way through to the finish line. We're not stopping here. So be sure to come back next week so we can finish up these quilts. I'm so excited.